Well, before I was a pastor, I worked in the IT industry as a consultant. And I remember during those days wanting to just really be part of the crew. Just wanting to kind of fit in and be accepted by everyone else. And I remember this moment. We were out having dinner at one of those German sort of brew houses, I think down in the Rocks or something in Sydney. And everyone was sort of dining in, tucking in. Pretzels, pork knuckles, sausages, steins, 1 litre steins of beer. And I just wanted to be part of the fun. I don't normally drink, but I thought, I'm going to give it a go anyway. I'm going to be one of the guys. And so I ordered myself a 1 litre stein of beer. There's nothing wrong with drinking beer, except if you're me, because if you're me, generally not only do you go really red if you drink just a drop of alcohol, but also I just feel like there's this kind of deep throbbing in my heart, and I kind of fall asleep. I literally just fall asleep. And so there I was with my 1 litre stein of beer, just having sort of small sips. I think it was like 3 sips in where I started to feel a bit kind of sleepy and kind of started nodding off at the dinner table as everyone was having a great time. I was kind of in the moment, when you're kind of trying to stay awake but asleep, and so you're like, it was pretty difficult. I think, by about half an hour in, I was probably half asleep at the dinner table. It was actually quite embarrassing. Maybe you found yourself in a situation wanting to kind of fit in. As we read this letter in Philippians, Paul's actually encouraging the church not just to be like everyone else around them. Actually, they're to be distinct and different. They're to be stars in the sky. And as stars, they're not only just to be distinct and different, they're supposed to sort of draw people, allure people to themselves. They are to live in such a way that people find them attractive and actually want to be like them instead of being repulsed by them because of their difference. And so today, as we look at this passage, I think there are some really key things there for us to live in the world around us that doesn't really have any interest in Christianity, to be distinct but also attractive to the people around us. There are 3 things that I think I want us to focus on today. Those 3 things are getting the balance right, recognizing our identity, and learning how to respond in delight and not duty. So 3 things for us to think about: being different but attractive. 3 things to think about being different but attractive. So the first thing I think comes from this passage is about getting the balance right. Paul talks about what it means to live in this world. And he says there in verse 12 and 13, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." As he talks about living in this world, obeying God's commands and being different, he says you do it by living wholeheartedly as a Christian, by giving everything of yourself. Work out your salvation. But then he also says in the same sentence, actually God is the one that works in you. And so to live differently, we need to get this balance right between us working and God working. Us working and God working. I think a helpful illustration of what this looks like is a seesaw. If you've been to a playground recently, actually you probably haven't because everyone's kind of inside, but if you were to go to a playground, or maybe you just remember growing up, seesaws kind of have one side, 2 sides really, the side that goes up and the other side goes down. The other side goes up and the other side goes down. You never have 2 sides going down or 2 sides going up. And so my children, when we go to the playground, they make me go on one side and make them go up and down because they really don't have enough power to sort of, with their legs, to jump up and down. Sometimes we think a bit about living for Jesus like a seesaw, in the sense that we put in an amount of effort, but we don't put in all the effort. God puts in a bit of effort as well. So for example, we might, in seeking to grow in patience, put in 80% of the effort, but God chips in the rest, 20% of the effort, in order for us to grow in patience. But Paul doesn't exactly say that in this passage, does he? What does he say? He says, actually, this seesaw is different when it comes to Jesus. It's not your normal seesaw, one side up, the other side down. It's one side up, the other side up. We try, God tries. We try, we're at 100% giving everything we have, and God works in us, doing everything He can in order to bring about that obedience in our hearts. What does this look like practically? Well, for example, say I'm trying to grow in patience to love someone. For me, I need to do everything I can in order to think about what it means for me to grow in patience. So that might mean in a moment when I'm really tempted to snap in anger, I might say, God, I just need your help. But I might also think of really practical things, like counting to 3 before saying anything, or maybe walking away before I do something that I will regret later. What does it mean for me to grow in patience? It means for me to apply myself. But more than that, that's what I'm doing, but God is still working at as well. And so God is renewing the desires of my heart, is strengthening me in order to become patient. And so as I work and as God works, what happens is I grow in patience. It's not that God does everything and I kind of sit around, or it's not that I do everything and God, just chips in that last 1% to kind of get me over the line. It's me and God 100%, 100%. And that's the balance that we see in the gospel, the good news of Jesus, as He takes root in our lives and transforms us to live differently. But let's talk a bit more about practically what that looks like. Verse 12, I think, helps us out as to what it means for us to live with all our effort to live differently. Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Salvation sometimes is seen as a specific reference where God saves people from His righteous anger for the things that we've done, our sin, the things that we've essentially done in disobedience. But I don't think Paul is saying actually work for your salvation. What he's saying here is he's having a broader reference as to what salvation is all about. Salvation here refers to the new life we have in God because He's already saved us. And so when Paul says work out your salvation or bring it to pass, it means live out that new life that God has rescued you to. Work out, bring to pass what it means to live with deep compassion, with steadfast love and overflowing generosity. He tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. That doesn't mean that we are afraid if we disobey, God's going to kind of zap us or whack us. It does mean that we live in reverence of who God is. And so we seek to live humbly and dutifully in compassion and mercy and kindness. Working out our salvation is to do everything we can to bring about this new life that God has saved us to. So when we think about this new life, it's really important that we recognize that working out our salvation is more than just a renewed desire. For example, you might have, I just have a desire to be more generous with my time and money. Or I'd really like to be less judgmental and critical. These are all good things to long for and to want. But that isn't the extent of working out our salvation. To work out your salvation is to apply everything you have in order to bring that to be. It's to live with a focused intentionality, to spend time reflecting on moments of temptation, to plan about how you're going to respond to those moments of temptation, and putting that plan into action. It's actually a lot of work as I think about it. I'm just tired. But that's the reality of what it means to live in obedience to God. To work out our salvation is to put every effort we can into living for Jesus. That's the first part of the gospel seesaw, that we work out our salvation, do everything we can. We go at 100%. But also there's a second part of the gospel seesaw, isn't there? It's that God would work in us. Do you notice there, verse 13? For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose. In verse 13, we are reminded that God is very much present in our lives as we live out or work out our salvation. And He's present in two particular ways. The first is that He works in you to will. That is, He renews the desires of our hearts. So what that means is it's not that we begrudgingly feel we need to sort of obey God's commands, but actually God changes our hearts to long for and to want to obey God's commands. We have a real and deep desire to grow in compassion, to be generous, to love those that we'd rather not love. But God doesn't just renew our hearts and give us a renewed passion for it. He actually equips and strengthens us for that. Do you notice that God works in us to act? He strengthens us to turn from temptation, to hate sin. He renews our desires, but then energizes us to do what He wills in us. God is powerfully at work in believers to bring about the obedience that He commands. And so that's really the gospel seesaw. We work 100%, giving everything we can, but then God works in us 100%, willing and acting so that we live out what it means to be saved by God. It's really important that we get this balance correct. And because if we think it's too much about us, we focus too much on what we're doing, then what happens is we can feel a big burden. It's all up to us, that if I fail, well, it's all over. There's this sense in which we're kind of helpless and hopeless once we give in to temptation. And so that's what happens if we focus too much on ourselves. But if we focus too much on God, it can mean that we don't feel like we have a sense of agency in our lives. It can actually mean that we kind of just do whatever, believing that God is somehow going to magically zap us and make us more loving or more compassionate, less critical or whatever. It's really important that we get the balance. But I think as we get the balance right, what happens is our lives are changed and transformed. We grow to live differently and distinctly from the world around us. And actually, instead of them turning their backs on us, they start to move towards us because the way we live is actually attractive. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is to recognize our identity. Paul longs for the Christian community in Philippi and for you, our church today, to be a foretaste of heaven, that we would be stars in the night sky, drawing people to us. And he says the way we get to this point is that we recognize our identity as children of God. It's really helpful to kind of understand the history of Israel, God's people in the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament. See, Israel, the nation of God, were known as God's children. In Exodus, you might have, it's the second book of the Bible. It's the moment where God rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt. He rescues them and He brings them through the wilderness, leading to them to a land that He has promised for them to inhabit, the land of Canaan. And as He leads them out of slavery and through the wilderness, Israel, God's children, complain to Him. And they grumble against Him. They don't have any food and water, and they accuse God of saying, "You've led us here into this desert to die." But God hears their cries, and He miraculously provides for them. They find water from a rock. They find food dropping from heaven. God satisfies their carnal thirsts and hunger by miraculously giving them food. Yet as He leads them through the wilderness, Israel, his children complain and grumble against Him, doubting His goodness and His faithfulness, even though He continues to provide for them. And so right at the end of their wilderness wandering, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses, the leader of God's people, says these words against the people. He says, "They are corrupt and not His children. To their shame they are a warped and crooked generation." Israel, God's children, actually said, "You're no longer God's children because you don't act like it. You grumble and complain, you do not trust, and you don't have faith in God." And so when we read in verse 14, Paul saying to the church, do everything without grumbling or complaining or arguing, what we're supposed to think in our minds is we're supposed to start to think about Israel, the way they acted. But Paul says, you're actually not like Israel. You're different. As you live out God's commands, as you refuse to grumble and complain, you confirm your identity as God's children. As you live out this new life, as you work out your salvation, actually you create for yourself this platform to be a beacon of hope in this world. Isn't that what he says in verse 15? Once they work out their salvation without grumbling and complaining, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. See, as blameless and pure, the Philippians stand in stark contrast to the pagan world around them. They're not just different, but attractive. There are two kinds of lights, aren't there? There are stars that you sort of see in the sky and they're like, wow, isn't that amazing? Not only are they different to the darkness, but they draw our attention and gaze because of their beauty. But then there are stars, and then there's kind of spotlights, real harsh spotlights that kind of pierce into us. And instead of like, wow, we're like, oh, get it away from me. Paul tells us that we are to be stars, alluring and attractive. Our difference or our distinctness is actually to draw people, not repel them away from us. But Paul tells us that as we shine like stars, it's not just about being attractive, that we would, to some degree, our light would pierce the darkness. I think that's what he infers in verse 16, that as they shine, they would hold firmly to the word of life. The word of life is the hope and the message of Jesus. And so into places of hopelessness, Paul longs for the church to speak words of hope, to speak the message of the hope of Jesus who saves people. As people shine like stars, there is to be a passive and an active element. The passive element is the way in which they live. They are to live differently from the people around us. And so I think a good question for us, and maybe for you right now, is to think, how different are you from your unbelieving friends or family members or neighbours? Do you live for others instead of yourself? Do you pursue the true and living God instead of the counterfeit idols that we see in this world? Do you live differently? To some extent, we must be distinct from the world around us. And if we're too much of the same, I wonder if we've just become like the world instead of drawing them into us and become like us. But the second element is not passiveness, but an activeness. And that is, we are to speak. Someone once coined the phrase, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. It's this idea that because of the way we live, we might draw people to know Jesus. That is true to an extent. But Paul reminds us there is an active element in which if we don't speak about who Jesus is, people will misinterpret our actions, thinking that we're just nice people. They won't really understand what it is to have true hope unless we talk about Jesus in contrast to the things of this world that are, in a sense, hopeless. There is a passive and active element to shining like stars. And so as we recognize our identity as God's children and live out our identity, distinct from the world around us, what happens is that we become this beacon of hope to the hopeless. We become a foretaste of God's steadfast love. We become this instrument of God's mercy and compassion to the world around us. So we need to get the balance right so we live differently, but then we need to also remember our identity so we don't go off track. And lastly, we need to respond in delight, not duty. As you read the rest of chapter 2, what we start to see is Paul and those that walk and work alongside Paul live distinctly from the world around them. They do so by just offering themselves in service of others instead of maybe stingily just holding back. We see in verse 17, Paul says, I pour out myself like a drink offering. Basically, there's this image of someone that has given everything for Jesus. In verses 20 and 21, we read about one of Paul's partners in ministry, Timothy. And he says of Timothy, he's just not interested in himself, but he has a deep concern for others. And then right at the end of chapter 2, we read about Epaphroditus. Verse 27, who was sick and who almost died for the work of the gospel in verse 30. Paul, Timothy, Epaphroditus, all these three basically gave everything for the work of Jesus. And that's what it meant for them to work out the salvation in their lives, to live obediently to God. And I think the challenge for us is to do the same. And not necessarily to go into pastoral ministry, but to give everything we have in service of God and His kingdom. I think that simply means to live obediently to God, to work out our salvation. Well, that's really hard, isn't it? I mean, it's really hard even simply to grow in obedience. I was thinking this week about what does it mean to grow as a parent, being patient with my children. I think for me, I'm just struggling to learn empathy. While things don't affect me, they might affect my children significantly, and so it's about learning to listen to them. It's about learning to have patience and love for them, even though I might not fully appreciate the things that they struggle with. But so often, instead of growing in obedience, of loving my family well, so often I know I'm someone that grumbles and complains. I grumble about them jumping on my back all the time and giving me a sore back, or leaving Lego around the house and me stepping on it, and in the middle of the night of all times. So often I grumble and complain like the Israelites. I doubt God is good and I wonder, why can't I have life better? And maybe you're like this. As you've sought to work out your salvation and live in obedience to God, so often what we found in our lives is that we grumble and complain instead of living like a child of God, seeking to trust God in moments when it's difficult. We act like an orphan, believing that God doesn't love or care for us and we just need to rely on ourselves. And so as we open the Bible and look at Jesus, Jesus becomes this wonderful beacon of hope. He experiences the broken world in which we live in, its harshness and its difficulty. Yet in all this, he doesn't grumble and complain, but lives in perfect obedience to his Father. When Jesus was baptized, we hear these words from heaven, "And this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." And so Jesus lives like that perfect beloved Son. He lives in this world humbly submitting himself to the will of the Father without grumbling and complaining. And even though he knows his future is filled with persecution and suffering and ultimately death, Jesus doesn't doubt the goodness of the Father. He doesn't grumble and complain. And the night before he was going to be crucified, Jesus speaks with his Father. And he could have at that moment chosen to say, "God, why don't you love me? Why do I have to do all this?" But his words are not of complaint, but of submission and trust. He says, "Yet not as I will, but as you will." And so the next day, Jesus is ultimately crucified on the cross. And as he's crucified on the cross, we see him being forsaken by God. The perfect and beloved Son is sort of cast out and abandoned by God. Why? Well, Jesus is cast out so that you might be brought near. And Jesus, the perfect Son, is abandoned so that you might be adopted and accepted by God. Instead of facing the fate of our own grumbling and complaining and being cast out of God's presence, being abandoned by him, Jesus is abandoned in our place. Jesus faces our fate, and because of that, we enjoy being brought into God's kingdom. How amazing is that? Instead of us, Jesus faces the fate. And so because of that, we're not orphans, sort of wandering and looking around for someone to love and care for us and protect us. We have the God of all creation. Isn't that amazing? See, as we grasp what Jesus has done, as we think about what it means to work out our salvation, we don't do that out of a sense of duty and obligation. I've got to do all this. A sense of delight. Because we long to please the one that has given everything for us. We find that being united to him in faith, we just have this overflowing delight in living for the one that loves us so much. And so I want to encourage you this week to work out your salvation, to live in obedience to God's commands, and do so out of delight and not duty, and do so knowing what Jesus has done for you. That's a bit of a daunting task if you ask me. I can think of so many things that I need to grow in to work out my salvation. And so I want to encourage you, if you're feeling a bit like me, a bit daunted, to pick one thing. Pick one thing this week that you want to work on. It might be a relationship with someone, growing in patience or more love or deeper compassion. It might be the way in which you think, being less critical or judgmental. Or it might be something as simply as how you use your time and thinking about what does it mean to prioritize God before everything else in my life. As you do this, remember the gospel seesaw. You try with all your might, but God works in us to act and to do his will. 100% us, 100% God. I think as we remember that, there's a sense of hope. We're not in this alone. Christ has given everything for us, and so we respond in delight as children of God. And we give everything for God. And he starts to work in our lives. As we do that, I think we will become distinct. But not just distinct, we'll start to attract people because we live with a sense of compassion and generosity and kindness and mercy that draws this world in instead of repelling them. Let me pray now that God will work in us. Let's pray. Gracious God, you are kind and good. We know that because you've sent Jesus. Help us to see this wonderful act of extravagant love, that he would be abandoned so that we might be adopted. And as we understand the fact that we are your children, help us live in a sense that we delight in obeying you, working out our salvation. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.